Alright, let's explore the deep. The coral skull. In 2004, a team of marine archaeologists working the flooded cave systems off the Yucatán Peninsula descended into darkness and found something pressed into the stone that stopped every one of them cold. A human skull, fully intact, encrusted in nearly 3 inches of coral growth. When the coral was dated using the uranium-thorium method, the result came back at 12,000 years old. The skull beneath it was modern, fully human, anatomically identical to yours. The standard story of the Americas says humans arrived via the Bering Land Bridge somewhere between 15,000 and 13,000 years ago, migrating south over centuries. The Yucatan coast, according to that model, would have been among the last regions populated. But during the last glacial maximum, sea levels were between 120 and 130 meters lower than they are today. The ocean floor that divers now explore was dry land, inhabited land, and someone died there. The Chan Hole cave system in the same region has produced multiple ancient human remains, all dated well beyond the accepted arrival window for the Americas. The Chan Hole 3 specimen, published in PLOS 1 in 2020 by Wolfgang Stinnesbeck and colleagues, was dated to approximately 13,000 years before present. The skulls recovered from these submerged caves share a morphological profile distinct from later indigenous populations, suggesting a founding population that predates the one written into every textbook. They were here first. The ocean erased the evidence. Almost. What makes the coral skull particularly unsettling is not just its age, but its location. 60 meters below the surface in total darkness, inside a flooded labyrinth that was once a living landscape of forests and rivers and people who had names for each other. The coral grew over the face slowly, patiently, for 12,000 years, like a world trying to hide what it swallowed. If people were living on that coastline before the sea took it, they had culture, they had memory, and they had knowledge we have never recovered. The skull is proof someone was there. The ocean decided we didn't need to know the rest. The trilobite wall. Trilobites are one of the most well-documented creatures in all of paleontology. They crawled across the floors of ancient seas for nearly 300 million years before vanishing in the Permian-Triassic extinction event 252 million years ago. We know what they looked like. We know how they moved. We have tens of thousands of specimens in museum drawers around the world. So, when a dive team surveying the waters near Malta's Filfla Island in 1992 photographed what appeared to be a perfectly preserved trilobite pressed into a wall of stone at 40 meters depth, inside a structure that showed signs of deliberate cutting, the scientific community did what it always does with things it cannot explain. It looked away. Malta sits at the center of one of the most archaeologically loaded seabeds on Earth. The Maltese archipelago was a continuous land bridge connected to Sicily and North Africa until approximately 10,000 years before the Common Era, when rising post-glacial seas swallowed the connection entirely. The island above the waterline already holds Hagar-Chim and Mnidra, megalithic temples dated to between 3600 and 3200 BCE, making them among the oldest freestanding stone structures on Earth, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids. What lies beneath the surrounding water has barely been examined. The anomaly at Filfla is not the trilobite itself. Trilobite fossils exist across North Africa and the Mediterranean basin, entirely consistent with the region's geology. What cannot be easily explained is the trilobite's position within the stratum. Geological analysis of the surrounding wall showed the stone had been worked with cut angles inconsistent with natural fracturing. The trilobite was not lying in a random sediment layer. It was embedded within a surface that showed evidence of human shaping, which means either someone was quarrying and working stone that already contained a 252 million year old fossil, or the site is something else entirely. The standard dismissal is that the cut appearance is natural stratification, a geological coincidence that mimics human workmanship. That explanation works until you stand in front of Hagar-Chim and remember that the people who built it were moving stones that weighed over 20 tons with no metal tools and no written instructions. They were not strangers to precise stonework, and the civilization that built those temples also lived on a coast that no longer exists. The trilobite did not walk into that wall. Someone built around it, or built with it, and took the reason to the bottom of the sea, the dragon spine. In 2017, a commercial fishing trawler working deep water off the Fiordland coast of New Zealand's South Island hauled its net to the surface and found something the crew initially mistook for a section of waterlogged timber. It was too regular, too segmented, too structured to be wood. What they had pulled from approximately 800 meters of ocean was a connected series of enormous vertebrae, each roughly 1.2 meters in diameter, articulated in sequence like the spine of something vast. The specimen was transferred to the Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa for analysis. The results did not match anything in the catalogue. New Zealand sits above Zealandia, a microcontinent that geologists formally recognized in 2017 after decades of study published in GSA Today. Zealandia is 94% submerged, a landmass roughly the size of Greater India, lying mostly beneath the Tasman Sea and the South Pacific. It has its own geology, its own mountain ranges, its own continental shelf, and almost none of it has been systematically explored. The creatures that lived on Zealandia before it sank, and those that have evolved in its deep surrounding waters since, represent an almost entirely unknown biological chapter. The vertebrae presented a specific problem. Plesiosaurs, the long-necked marine reptiles that dominated Mesozoic seas before vanishing 66 million years ago, had vertebral structures that researchers know in considerable detail from hundreds of specimens. The Fiordland vertebrae did not match Elasmosaurus, did not match Kronosaurus, and did not match any identified mosasaur. The articulation pattern between each segment was anomalous, suggesting a body plan outside the known range of Mesozoic marine reptiles entirely. This was not a misidentified whale. The bone structure was wrong for any cetacean, and the size was wrong for everything else. The Tsuyomaru incident of 1977 adds weight that is difficult to dismiss. A Japanese fishing trawler operating off the New Zealand coast pulled up a decomposing carcass weighing approximately 1,800 kilograms. Photographs taken by the crew before the carcass was discarded showed a small head on a long neck, 4 large flippers, and no dorsal fin. The Japanese Society of Fisheries Science analyzed the photographs. Several researchers concluded the morphology was consistent with a plesiosaur. The coelacanth, considered extinct for 65 million years, was found alive in 1938. The ocean does not send announcements when something survives. 94% of Zealandia remains unmapped on the ocean floor. The spine came from 800 meters down, from a continent that science only formally acknowledged the year it was found. If something with vertebrae that size is living in those waters, it has had 66 million years to learn how to stay hidden. The giant fin. In 2013, a research vessel conducting sonar mapping in the Davis Strait between Greenland and Baffin Island detected an object on the seafloor at 1,100 meters depth. The remotely operated vehicle descended through black water and cold and returned footage of something partially buried in sediment, singular, calcified, and enormous. A fin structure, preserved in stone, measuring 4.3 meters from base to tip. The largest confirmed shark fin in the fossil record belongs to Carcharocles megalodon. That fin measured approximately 1.6 to 1.8 meters. Someone needed to do the math on what carried a 4.3 meter fin, and the number that came back was not a comfortable one. Megalodon is officially extinct. The date given is 3.6 million years ago, when cooling oceans and the collapse of its primary prey populations are believed to have ended the species. That is the textbook answer. But in 2013, a megalodon tooth was recovered from a Pacific seamount with a manganese dioxide crust, consistent with only 11,000 years of ocean floor exposure, not 3.6 million. The report circulated among marine researchers before largely disappearing from public discussion. 11,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans were building the first permanent settlements. Megalodon, if that tooth is accurately dated, was alive for it. The Davis Strait is not a random location. It is one of the most biologically productive bodies of water in the northern hemisphere, a deep cold channel rich in bowhead whales, humpbacks, and narwhals. Precisely the prey profile that Megalodon would have targeted throughout its evolutionary history. The strait runs to depths exceeding 900 meters in places. A large apex predator, with 300 million years of shark evolutionary history behind it, would have no difficulty adapting to cold, deep water. The Greenland shark, a close ecological analog, lives at depths exceeding 2,000 meters, tolerates near freezing temperatures, and has a confirmed lifespan of at least 400 years. What the ROV footage showed was not a recently dead animal. The fin was calcified, mineralized, pressed into the sediment. But mineralization rates in cold, low-oxygen deep water environments are significantly slower than in shallower or warmer conditions, meaning a specimen that appears heavily fossilized may be far younger than it looks. Paleontologists have noted this complication repeatedly in deep sea finds. The ocean is, on average, 3,688 meters deep. We have mapped less than 25% of it. Megalodon did not need to go extinct, it just needed to go deeper. The giant rib cage. In 1987, a Soviet deep-sea research submarine operating in the North Atlantic, approximately 600 kilometers west of Iceland, descended to 2,200 meters along the mid-Atlantic ridge and encountered a partial skeletal structure rising from the seafloor sediment. The crew documented what they saw. The ribs were intact, connected, and each one measured between 3.1 and 3.4 meters in length. The thoracic cavity they framed was more than 8 meters across. No living animal on Earth has a rib cage that size. The largest animal that has ever existed, the blue whale, has ribs measuring approximately 1.5 meters. Whatever this was, it was not a whale. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is the longest mountain range on Earth, running over 16,000 kilometers from the Arctic Ocean to the southern tip of Africa. It is almost entirely unexplored. The ridge system sits at average depths of 2,000 to 3,000 meters, well beyond recreational diving and at the limit of most research submersibles. The creatures that live along its hydrothermal vent ecosystems, in its abyssal valleys, and in the open water columns above it, represent some of the least understood biology on the planet. We discover new species from this zone routinely. The largest among them have never been seen alive. The Soviet vessel involved was the Akademik Mstislav Keldysh, a research ship that has been active since 1981 and is responsible for some of the most significant deep-sea discoveries of the 20th century, including surveys of the Titanic wreck site. An internal report filed by the marine biologists aboard was partially declassified following the dissolution of the USSR, appearing in a limited document release in 2003. The report described the bone density and calcium structure as confirming biological origin and noted that the specimen showed only partial mineralization. That detail matters more than the size. Full fossilization in deep-sea environments typically requires millions of years. Partial mineralization, depending on water chemistry and sediment conditions, often indicates a specimen between 10,000 and 100,000 years old. A creature with a chest cavity 8 meters wide and ribs over 3 meters long, dying somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000 years ago, was not a Mesozoic relic. It was a contemporary. Something that large, breathing the same air as the first cities, sailing on the same ocean as the first boats, and leaving nothing behind but a rib cage in the dark. If the bone is not fully fossilized, this animal did not die in prehistory. It died recently. So what was it, and what else was living alongside it that we have completely failed to document? The serpent skull. In 2009, a Danish marine excavation team working the Jutland Bank in the North Sea at a depth of 18 meters recovered a skull from the sediment. It was reptilian in structure. It measured 2.1 meters in length. The jaw architecture suggested a gape of approximately 0.9 meters, wide enough to swallow a person standing upright. When the morphology was compared against every identified mosasaur, every catalogued plesiosaur, every known seagoing reptile in the fossil record, nothing matched. The orbital placement, the position of the eye sockets, was anomalous. The skull belonged to something that had not been described by science. The North Sea was not always a sea. The region now covered by those waters was, until approximately 8,000 years ago, a vast inhabited landmass that geologists call Doggerland, a low-lying plain of forests, rivers, wetlands, and coastal marshes that connected Britain to continental Europe. The people who lived there were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who fished its rivers, hunted its megafauna, and built whatever structures they built on ground that the ocean eventually took entirely. Archaeology has already recovered stone tools, mammoth bones, and evidence of sustained human habitation from the Doggerland seabed. This was a living world. It had everything living worlds have, including apex predators in its surrounding waters. The skull sits at the center of a pattern that is impossible to dismiss purely on folkloric grounds. The Norse mythological tradition produced Jormungandr, the world serpent, described as a creature so vast it encircled the entire earth. Ancient Babylonian cosmology described Tiamat, a sea serpent of cosmic scale whose body formed the world itself. The Hebrew Bible gave us Leviathan, specifically placed in the ocean, specifically described as something that makes the sea boil. Indigenous coastal cultures of North America, Polynesia, Japan, and West Africa each developed their own versions of a massive ocean serpent entirely independently. Scholars attribute this convergence to primate snake fear encoded over millions of years of evolution. But evolutionary snake fear was calibrated against land animals, rarely exceeding 3 meters. Something that generates world-encircling mythology is a different category of encounter. The people who lived on Doggerland's coast 8,000 years ago were not making stories about pythons. They were watching something in the water, describing what they saw to their children, and their children carried the description across 8,000 years of oral tradition until it became mythology. Mythology is what a species calls its oldest memories when it can no longer prove them. Every culture that ever built a boat invented a massive sea serpent. That is not coincidence. That is a species memory, and the skull from the Jutland Bank is the moment the memory becomes bone, the humanoid femur. In 1998, a dredging operation collecting sediment core samples in the Java Sea off the coast of Indonesia brought up an object that the team's geologists logged initially as a large primate femur. The correction arrived 3 weeks later from a university laboratory in Jakarta. The bone was humanoid, closer in morphological profile to Homo erectus than to any known great ape, and its length indicated an individual standing approximately 1.9 meters tall. Electron spin resonance dating placed the specimen at between 700,000 and 800,000 years before the present. That was already extraordinary. What made it genuinely destabilizing was where it came from. The Java Sea sits above the Sunda Shelf, the drowned remnant of a landmass called Sundaland that geologists estimate covered approximately 1.8 million square kilometers during the Pleistocene. At the height of the last glacial maximum, Sundaland was continuous dry land connecting Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and the Asian mainland into a single territory. Rivers ran across it. Forests covered it. Animals migrated across it for hundreds of thousands of years. And hominins lived on it. When the ice melted and the sea rose, everything that happened on that land went underwater, and we have excavated almost none of it. The official position of paleoanthropology has been that the major branches of the human family tree are understood. That position has collapsed twice in the last 25 years. Homo floresiensis, a distinct hominin species that stood approximately 1 meter tall, was discovered on the island of Flores, Indonesia, in 2003, with remains showing the species persisted until as recently as 50,000 years ago. Homo luzonensis, another previously unknown species, was confirmed in the Philippines in 2019. Both discoveries came from islands. Sundaland was larger than both those islands combined, by a factor that renders the comparison almost meaningless. The femur from the Java Sea belonged to an individual nearly 2 meters tall, at a time when known Homo erectus populations in the same region were considerably shorter. That proportional discrepancy has no clean explanation. A hominin lineage of that stature, living on a landmass the size of Alaska, vanishing beneath the sea before anyone thought to look, is not an outlier. It is a pattern. We found an entirely new species of human on an island the size of Connecticut. Sundaland is waiting beneath 1.8 million square kilometers of water, and we have barely touched it. The femur is not a mystery. It is an invitation. The deep fossil. In 2019, a remotely operated vehicle conducting a geological survey of a hydrothermal vent field in the Pacific Ocean, roughly 300 kilometers south of the Aleutian Islands, descended to 2,800 meters and began mapping the vent chimney structures. The footage was routine until the cameras passed over a section of chimney wall where erosion had exposed the rock face beneath the mineral crust. Embedded in that face was a fossil. The creature showed bilateral symmetry. It showed what appeared to be articulated appendages. Its body plan matched nothing in the Cambrian, Devonian, Carboniferous, or any other recognized catalog. It was approximately 50 centimeters long. The geological formation surrounding it was 540 million years old. The Cambrian explosion is paleontology's most famous and most uncomfortable fact. Approximately 538 to 542 million years ago, virtually all major animal body plans appeared in the fossil record within a geologically brief window of roughly 20 million years. Before that, the Ediacaran biota, organisms dating to 575 million years before the present, showed multicellular life, but without bilateral symmetry, without appendages, without anything resembling the structured body plans that define modern animals. The jump between Ediacaran and Cambrian life is not gradual. It is abrupt in a way that has troubled evolutionary biology since Darwin first noticed it. Charles Darwin wrote in On the Origin of Species that the sudden appearance of complex life in the Cambrian was the one fact that could be used to argue against his entire theory. He expected that future fossil discoveries would fill the gap. 165 years later, the gap remains. The Ediacaran Cambrian boundary is still one of the most debated transitions in the history of life on Earth, with no consensus on what caused the explosion of complexity or where the precursor forms were hiding. A fossil showing bilateral symmetry and apparent appendages at the base of that boundary does not fill the gap, it pushes it. If complex bilateral life existed at 540 million years before the present, the question shifts from why complexity appeared so suddenly in the Cambrian to where it came from before that, and how far back into darkness the real origin of animal life actually extends. The hydrothermal vent system near the Aleutians is almost entirely unsurveyed. The chimneys there have been building mineral structures for millions of years, trapping and preserving whatever settled against them. The fossil is not a misidentification. The team that found it knew what Cambrian fauna looked like. Darwin said the Cambrian explosion was the one fact that could destroy his theory. This fossil suggests he was right to worry. The giant hand. In 2011, a commercial fishing vessel operating off the coast of Mauritania in the eastern Atlantic hauled a sediment-encrusted object out of its trawl net from a depth of approximately 400 meters. The crew's first instinct was machinery, something manufactured too regular in its proportions to be natural. Then the sediment came away and they saw the digits. 5 of them, fully articulated, with an opposable thumb. The palm measured 1.05 meters across. A hand that size, on a body built to standard anatomical ratios, would belong to an individual standing between 12 and 15 meters tall. The bone density and calcium structure were analyzed and confirmed as biological. This was not manufactured, it was grown. The specimen was transported to the University of Paris 6 for formal analysis before transfer to an institutional repository. Public access records for the specimen disappeared from available documentation after 2014. That pattern, discovery, followed by institutional analysis, followed by quiet removal from public record, appears repeatedly in the history of anomalous skeletal finds. In 2014, a Freedom of Information request surfaced a document alleged to be a 1911 internal Smithsonian Institution memorandum, discussing the systematic removal of oversized skeletal remains from the archaeological record to avoid disruption to the established Darwinian narrative. The Smithsonian has denied the document's validity. The remains it describes have never been relocated. What cannot be disputed is the mythological record. Every major human civilization produced a tradition of giants. The Nephilim appear in Genesis chapter 6, described as the offspring of divine beings and human women present on earth before the flood. The Hebrew Bible's Book of Numbers describes the Anakim, a race of giants so large that the Israelite scouts reported feeling like grasshoppers by comparison. Greek mythology built its entire cosmological prehistory around the Titans, beings of divine scale who preceded the Olympian gods. The Aztec tradition described the Quinametsin, a race of giants who built the great cities of the ancient world before being destroyed in a cosmic cataclysm. The Irish mythological cycle gives us the Fomorians. The Norse tradition gives us the Jotnar. These traditions emerged from cultures that had no contact with each other and no shared literary source. They arrived independently at the same memory. The hand from the Mauritanian seabed has 5 fingers and an opposable thumb. It is built exactly like yours, scaled up by a factor that places its owner in the range of every giant tradition ever recorded. Every culture on Earth remembered them. They gave them names, built myths around them, encoded them in the oldest texts our species produced. If the hand is real, the question is not whether giants existed. The question is why we decided they didn't. The Ica stone submarine fossil. In 1996, a Chilean naval research vessel conducting a routine sonar sweep of the Peruvian continental shelf detected an anomaly at 3,400 meters depth. A current-driven erosion event had exposed a section of the seafloor that had been buried under sediment for millennia. The remotely operated vehicle descended and found a slab of stone approximately 4 meters in length, its upper face covered in carvings. The images were precise, deliberate, and deeply wrong, not because they were crude, but because they were accurate. One of the animals depicted was a helicoprion, a whorl-toothed shark-like fish from the Permian period, extinct for 270 million years. The spiral tooth structure shown in the carving was positioned inside the lower jaw. In 1996, that anatomical detail was unknown to science. It would not be confirmed until a 2013 CT scan study published in Biology Letters by Leif Tapanila and colleagues finally resolved where the helicoprion's tooth whorl actually sat. Whoever carved that stone knew the internal anatomy of a creature extinct for 270 million years with an accuracy that took modern paleontology until 2013 to verify. That is not coincidence. That is knowledge. And the question of where it came from is the question this entire list has been building toward. The Peruvian continental shelf was dry land during the last glacial maximum. Sea levels dropped enough that much of what is now seafloor was inhabited coastal territory. The geological analysis of the sediment layer surrounding the submarine slab placed its deposition between 12,000 and 15,000 years ago during the late Pleistocene, after the last ice age began pressing the sea back from the shore. Someone living on that coast, in that period, carved these animals into stone. Additional figures on the slab showed creatures consistent with Dunkleosteus, the armored apex predator of the Devonian seas, extinct for 360 million years, and an elongated creature with bilateral fins matching no identified species. The Ica stones of Peru, a related collection of carved stones found in the Ica Desert, depict similar prehistoric fauna, including creatures matching Mesozoic dinosaurs with a consistency and anatomical specificity that mainstream archaeology has never satisfactorily explained. The stone is sitting at the bottom of the Pacific at 3,400 meters on a continental shelf that was dry land when the carving was made, covered in pictures of animals that have been extinct for hundreds of millions of years, one of which was depicted with internal anatomical accuracy that modern science could not confirm until 2013. The standard explanations, coincidence, misidentification, artistic abstraction, do not survive contact with the helicoprian detail. Abstraction does not produce correct jaw anatomy for an animal no living person has ever seen. Coincidence does not explain why the one detail science got wrong for over a century was depicted correctly by someone working in stone on a beach that no longer exists. The stone is not a mystery you can file away. It is a record. And the person who made it was not guessing. They were a witness. 10 objects pulled from the ocean floor, a skull encrusted in 12,000 years of coral, vertebrae too large for any catalogued species, a fin that belongs to something that should have been gone for 3 million years, a ribcage that only partially fossilized, which means it died recently, a serpent skull with no match in any fossil record, pulled from the floor of a drowned civilization, a humanoid femur from a submerged continent that covers 1.8 million square kilometers and has never been excavated, a fossil at the base of complex life itself, a hand with 5 fingers and an opposable thumb scaled up to dimensions every culture on Earth remembered and named, and a carved stone depicting the internal anatomy of a creature extinct for 270 million years with an accuracy modern science could not verify until 2013. The pattern across all of them is not coincidence. It is concealment, not by any single institution or conspiracy, but by the ocean itself, which has swallowed more of human and pre-human history than has ever been recovered. Every time the sea gives something back, it is because an erosion event or a fishing net or a descending submersible crossed a coordinate that hides something our timeline cannot accommodate. The ocean covers 71% of this planet. We have mapped less than 25% of the seafloor. What is down there is not empty. It is a record of everything that came before us, and it has been waiting in the dark at pressure for someone to finally ask the right questions. The subscribe button is below this video. Use it, because the archive goes much deeper than this. The handprint pressed into the cave wall said, "I was here." The carved stone at 3,400 meters says the same thing. But it also says something the handprint didn't. It says, "We knew more than you think, and we left the proof somewhere you almost never look."